Okay, so we are now, recording. So welcome everybody to the second panel. There are three panels organized by us in the Latina Latinx Literature and Culture Society. And today's panel is entitled Trauma, Kinship, and Speculative Latinx Literature. And we do today have four speakers. The first speaker will be Sofi Chávez from Berkeley. And her talk will be entitled We the Animals as Queer Latino Gothic, Diaries, Desire, and the Impossibility of Normative Kinship.
Okay, hello, I'm just going to share my slides. Okay, hopefully it keeps my video in the corner there. Okay, hello. My name is Sofi Chávez. Thank you for accommodating me virtually. It's a joy to be with you all finally. My paper title has shifted a little, so I'll be reading my paper entitled Rican Monsters, Queer Archives, Justin Torres's We the Animals and the Latinx Gothic. Justin Torres's 2011 novel, We the Animal, follows an unnamed protagonist as he narrates his experiences growing up as one of three brothers in a mixed race Anglo and Afro-Puerto Rican family. Like many canonical Puerto Rican and Latinx novels, Torres's is an autobiographical coming-of-age novel as he navigates siblinghood, masculinity, parental abuse, and queerness. However, Torres's narration notably departs from the canon in three critical ways: its lyricism as opposed to social realism, ambivalent claims to Latinx legibility, as well as the narrator's queerness. Torres's ambivalence towards Latinidad stems partially from his sexuality as well as mixed Blackness, but also because he was not raised in an urban area, densely populated with other Puerto Ricans. So we might see this novel as contrasting with Down These Mean Streets, for example, as it's set in rural upstate New York. Torres's novel serves as an intervention into the literary canon because he adheres to queerness's interventions in time while maintaining a Latinx preoccupation with space, which we see through Torres's investment in water as a symbol of Rican identity. While We the Animals has been cast under many genres, prose poetry, LGBT fiction, coming-of-age novel, autobiographical fiction, I want to add to this list to consider Torres's novel's queer form as a Frankenstein-like creation which utilizes Gothic tropes, wherein the monstrous symbolizes the historical continuities of race and sexuality for Puerto Rican subjects. In so doing, Torres's protagonist appears as a queer monster who is a product of his own mixed-race Rican family rather than a contemporary aberration. The presence of water marks the text as a Latinx Gothic for its symbolism of the relationship between the US and Puerto Rico, and therefore water becomes a site of identity formation and ethnic memory. The protagonist's queer encounters with water thus symbolize the entanglements of race, sexuality, family, and colonial histories. Much like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Torres's protagonist is a product of the archive. For the sake of time, I'll limit my discussion of textual archival moments, but I'll quickly summarize some key instances where this textual archive is imbued with erotic meaning. Throughout the text, Torres describes the protagonist as an avid reader, which mark him with, quote, white ways and a pansy scent, unlike his brothers. As the protagonist advances into his teenage years, he also becomes a prolific diarist. Like the role of letter writing within Shelley's Frankenstein, the revelation of this text drives the plot forward. The discovery of the protagonist's diary and his sexual perversions it holds serves as the final proof of the protagonist's queerness, which compel his family to institutionalize him. Torres also uses the archive to thematize the co-constitution of visuality and narrativity, where in one scene, he and his brothers encounter pornographic film for the first time, and the film in question portrays a teenage boy on his bed reading. We might see that fixed forms of textuality in film challenge the coherence of the protagonist's Latinx identity, which provides an opening for the embodied archive, which he crafts through engagement with water to construct new meanings. I want to focus today on two scenes when the protagonist engages water and appears as a subaquatic Rican monster, This is a term I'm borrowing from Sandra Ruiz. First, a scene where he learns to swim, and then I'll close with a later chapter towards the end of the novel when he's dancing in a projected archival film footage of Niagara Falls. Fairly early in the novel, 4 thin chapters in, the protagonist and his family drive to a nearby lake one night to cool off during a heat wave. One of the first markers of our protagonist's difference is that unlike his brothers, he does not know how to swim. So he climbs on his mother's back, who climbs on his father's back, and they 3 swim together. Once his father has brought them to the deepest part of the lake, he suddenly slips away from both the boy and his wife unannounced, leaving the two to either sink or learn to swim. Torres recounts his experience of coming into boyhood in the following sprawling passage. I let myself slide down and down, and when I opened my eyes, what I discovered there, black-green murkiness, an underwater world, terror. I sank down for a long time, disoriented and writhing, and then suddenly I was swimming, kicking my legs and spreading my arms just like Pops had shown me long before, and rising up to the light and exploding into air, and then that first breath, sucking air all the way down into my lungs. And when I looked up, the sky had never been so vaulted, so sparkling and magnificent. I remembered the urgency in my parents' voices. I swam toward their bobbing mass, and there under the stars I was wanted. They had never been so happy to see me. They had never looked at me with such intensity and hope. They had never before spoken my name so softly. I remembered how Ma burst into tears and Pop celebrated, shouting, as if he were a mad scientist and I a marvel of his creation. He's alive, he's alive, he's alive. Though Torres's protagonist finally learns to swim, he affirms this boyhood masculinity through eroticized queer movements. Torres repeats an up and down motion, sliding down, rising up, exploding and sucking down, where he endures suffocation through grammars of submission and pleasure. The simultaneous sucking, going down, and getting off asserts his queer embodiment as an application of his father's own swimming lessons, rather than an invention of his own. Torres underscores this queer continuity between father and son through the father's Frankenstein-like cries of life. For the protagonist to be marked as queer then, through mimicry of his father's gestures, asserts that his father must have had a role in his son's formation, and that the protagonist has history and continuity with his family. For Torres to affirm likeness to his father's Afro-Puerto Rican masculinity instantiates water as a site of ethnic memory. This moment illustrates not only the formation of the protagonist's embodied archive, but also the ways in which identity formation is an engagement with the archive. Like Jose Muñoz's contention that the past is performative, the protagonist's experiences of receptivity from his parents are only so sweet because of the history of lack, denial, and suffocation. Within the scene, Torres thematizes temporality when he writes that his father taught him long before, that his parents had renewed urgency in their voices, as well as the repetition of they had never been so, they had never looked so, they had never before spoken so softly. We might see the space of water as a metaphor for colonial beingness, where the protagonist's survival depends on his capacity to derive queer pleasure from the process of laboring against death. I'm also struck in this passage by Torres's linked phrases, disoriented and writhing, kicking and spreading, rising and exploding. Not only do they further convey a body in ecstasy, but they conjure a plural and multiple sense of self. At first, when the protagonist was left alone by his father, Torres writes in segregated, spliced phrases, which emphasizes his separation and subsequent terror in the underwater world. It strikes me that this turn to coupling is a function of Torres's aesthetic and political form. In his refusal to collapse his identity into one neat phrase, or to choose sexuality over his family, to separate pleasure and pain. We see then that water as Rican archive becomes pleasurable through its nonlinearity and through the inability to reject any interpenetrations within identity formation. We might see the subaquatic Rican body as a manifestation of Torres's historical project, wherein the lines between past, present, and future converge and become luxuriously wrinkled. The subaquatic Rican body is the historical Rican body, where the contemporary Rican gestures index their own erotic archives. Within Rican performance art, Sandra Ruiz writes that subaquatic Rican breath emerges in Rican aesthetics to demonstrate ongoing endurance against US colonialism. Ruiz writes that the ongoing colonization of Puerto Rico by the US produces a mode of being in time where Rican subjects experience spasmodic, belabored breath, and at times must hold their heads steady underwater for prolonged moments. And these are prolonged experiences of racial economic oppression. For the subaquatic Rican body, Ruiz writes, holding one's breath is about surrendering any and all grip to historiography and plunging in the dynamic nonlinear time in order to declare something about the living while prefiguring the dying. I would add to this that the subaquatic Rican body is also a sensuous feeling body. Underwater, we sense our weightlessness without loss of density and are reminded of the vibrancy and potential of our flesh. The body is at once completely physically surrounded and has a porous relationship with the underwater world. We can open our eyes, become luxuriously wrinkled, and swallow, gulp, and gasp. This otherworldliness limns the contours of a utopic world where surrendering one's grip on shameful identifications with the past enables a more fluid mode of being. In a subsequent vignette closer to the novel's close, Torres's protagonist is left alone for hours in the Museum of Curiosities at Niagara Falls. He's left there by his father. While here, the protagonist encounters a 3-minute film projected on a loop, which portrays barrel jumpers from the early 20th century. In this encounter with archival materials, the protagonist dances within the light of the projector. Torres writes, "The waterfall projected across my face and arms. I moved closer to the wall so that the waterfall swallowed me up and I danced. I pretended I was a merboy prince and it was my job to try to catch all the men in barrels and save them from their deaths. But when I cupped my hands and reached up, they always slipped through. When they disappeared over the edge, I danced a special underwater dance so that their souls could go up to heaven. Soon I stopped trying to save them at all because I was consumed in the death dance. Spinning on my toes and looking down at my body, the water slipping and rushing over me, I slithered my arms and wiggled my hips against the current." Thinking back to the earlier scene where death in water would come from the protagonist's own suffocation, the protagonist now attempts to save the men falling to their deaths within the archive. This film invokes the Gothic trope of the dead coming back to life via the archive, where their death and liveness plays on a loop forever. While at first the protagonist attempts to stop the loop, he eventually is caught up in the pleasure of the death dance, which we might see as actually his proof of his own endurance in the face of death or in the face of fixity. In this way, the protagonist enacts his own death-defying feat, being a queer Rican, dancing to a rhythm of his own making, even while this loop appears. This scene exemplifies the utopic potential of underwater worlds, as well as conveys Torres's larger preoccupation with historical narrativity. After all, according to Sandra Ruiz, Rican aesthetic interventions in time stem from an anti-colonial narrative impulse. In each encounter with the archive, Torres illustrates the protagonist's ability to endure amidst heteropatriarchal colonial histories, yet still, quote, pleasure himself with the past, unquote, as Elizabeth Freeman writes. While the early 20th century marked the beginning of the Foraker Act and Puerto Rico's ongoing economic and political subjugation by the US, Torres's protagonist engages with this potentially harmful relic of American historical identity as a queer merboy prince, and himself penetrates the archive by entering the light of the projector. In this way, he embodies Elizabeth Freeman's notion of erotohistoriography, wherein the literary historical subject becomes monstrous, quote, because he lets history too far in, going so far as to embody it instead of merely feeling it. As he sensuously slithers and wiggles his hips along the archival grain, he emerges from engagement with lost phobic objects, not a transparent Rican monster, but a sensuous mer boy, a more magnificent, resplendent half-breed. In this instance, the subaquatic Rican body appears not as abject or colonized in a fixed sense, nor merely contained by the archive, but as a performative practice of near-death and liveness. Tropes of the Gothic, preoccupation with historicity, monsters, isolation, secrecy, enable Torres to grapple with ongoing colonialism and economic oppression, such as those forces that drive his family into rural poverty and the racism that make them monstrous in the eyes of dominant society. Torres's interventions into the Gothic through race and sexuality also intervene into the historicity of the Puerto Rican family, where survival and pleasure stem from a porous relationship between self and other, past and present. Perhaps Water shows us what it means for brown queerness to exist as a contemporary vestige of the past, while alerting us to the sensuous evidence that it is indeed possible to be some other murkier way. Thank you.
Okay, I'll go on. All right. So next speaker is Dr. Cathryn Merla-Watson from University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, or UTRGV. Her paper is entitled Hauntologies of the Oppressed, Rereading Woman Hollering Creek as Domestic Horror. Dr. Cathryn Merla-Watson is an associate professor of Mexican American Studies at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, as well as the director of Gender and Women's Studies. She has published in journals such as Aslan and Melis, as well as in numerous edited collections. She's the co-editor of Altermundos, Latino Speculative Literature, Film, and Popular Culture, and is currently working on a book manuscript examining the apocalyptic in queer Chicana performance. So it's all you.
Thank you. Let me check the time here real quick. So my presentation is a little bit more informal than usual. And I thought what I would do this time is sort of talk through parts, because what I'm reading is a very, very rough draft of something that was due actually a few months ago for this wonderful edited collection on basically theorizing the ghostly and the spectral in Latinx cultural production. And so previously, my work has focused on the speculative more broadly, which includes Latinx science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And so I've shifted more recently to examining what the Latinx Gothic and Latinx horror and related subgenres like the apocalyptic, like the book manuscript that Cristina mentioned. And so whenever I talk about my work, I always mention the work of Jordan Peele and Get Out, because I think it's a very sort of obvious example of horror from the perspective of a person of color, and it really sort of foregrounds how horror, and we can make this claim about the speculative more broadly, that it names a kind of structure of feeling, which then sort of then begs questions about intersectionality and subjectivity and the different ways in which we experience the lived world. Okay, so what I'm trying to do in this very rough draft, which I've renamed still Hauntology of the Oppressed, is the Mexicana Gothic and Spectral Geographies in Woman Hollering Creek. And there's a little bit of scholarship out there that begins to theorize the what we might tentatively call the Latinx Gothic, and there's certainly a lot of criticism on Woman Hollering Creek, of course, and I'm referring to the short story, not necessarily the larger collection of short stories, which Woman Hollering Creek is a part. And sort of the basic question is, what happens when we reread Woman Hollering Creek through the Gothic lens? particularly how can we sort of reapproach the figure of La Llorona, or the main spectral figure in this short story. So I begin the piece by sort of talking about, and I'm just going for the sake of time to talk through some parts. So I begin the piece by talking about my own memory as being a young mixed race Chicana in San Antonio. And my cousin was babysitting me for New Year's Eve while the rest of the adults were out partying and having a good time. And she told, and so my older cousin told me for the first time, or my first time, about La Llorona. And I won't go into, I think most of us, or we on this panel, know this folklore, right? But one of the things that stuck out to me then and still sticks out to me now about this folklore that, to my knowledge, I haven't really heard any other sort of scholar folklorist tease out is, and certainly they've teased out themes of like claustrophobia and immobility in Woman Hollering Creek. But I think the folklore of La Llorona lends itself to that as well, that like this woman is literally, or this ghost is like trapped at whatever given body of water. Like forever she has to haunt or remain at this body of water, calling out for her children, or whichever version you're familiar with, which is surprising because I feel like in many ways that is this theme of immobility that adheres for me in this folklore really is sort of leveraged within the short story of Woman Hollering Creek. Okay, so it is precisely these horrific elements of spatial constraint and immobility within the folklore of La Llorona that Sandra Cisneros' 1992 short story, Woman Hollering Creek, illuminates. So Woman Hollering Creek is the titular story of Woman Hollering Creek, the longer, which is the longer book of short stories. And it centers on a young woman, Cleofilas, from a small town in Mexico who immigrates to Seguin, Texas, a small Texas town, after marrying her husband, Juan Pedro. Romanticized fantasies of marital bliss quickly morphs into a domestic nightmare as Cleofilas becomes entrapped in not only a foreign town where she does not speak English and is pregnant and with an infant, but also the vice grip of domestic violence. La Llorona, evoked by the story's title, animates the story's geography, delimiting where Cleofilas can go and whom she can become. To be sure, Chicana feminist literary scholarship, such as Mary Pat Brady, Dalia Candioti, Sonia Saldívar-Hull, has thoroughly examined how Woman Hollering Creek foregrounds how working class Mexican immigrant women become ensnared by patriarchal social structures, limiting out the story's claustrophobic aspects. While Mary Pat Brady underscores the story's urgency of space, Dalia Candioti teases out themes of enclosure and confinement echoed in this diasporic immigrant short story. Saldívar-Hull further unearths how transnational popular forms of representation and discourses function to constrict Chicana and Mexican immigrant women's gender roles. Yet curiously, given the horrifying and spectral valences of Woman Hollering Creek, to my knowledge, this short story has yet to be approached through the lens of the Gothic horror genre or as subgenres and contemporary offshoots, including the female Gothic and domestic horror. Building upon Chicana feminist spatial approaches to Woman Hollering Creek that unearth the story's spatial urgency, I reinterpret the story through the prism of the Gothic, and more specifically, what I term the Mexicana Gothic, borrowing from, of course, Rosalinda Fregoso. Fregoso asserts that Mexicana, quote, calls attention to the intersections among the multiple narratives of race, gender, sexuality that inform nation building, end quote. approaching Woman Hollering Creek through the Michigan Gothic, I submit signals a departure from Eurocentric notions of the ghostly, which often revolve around like a sort of singular ghost, or a ghost that represents like an event, or a like individual trauma that must be fixed by an individual. It's very sort of individualistic, right? So like Hamlet's ghost, for example, where it's perhaps his, father, and he has to like write the ills that, or crimes that have been ostensibly committed against his father. And it's also very patriarchal, right? So resituating and mooring the spectrally, specifically La Llorona, and the material reality of domestic violence and femicide she conveys within the specific context of the US-Mexico borderlands, the complex terrain of what the editors of this collection term the Latin indigenous, excuse me. As such, the Michigan Gothic and perhaps all US ethnic Gothic genres signal a methodology, a particular way of reading and knowing. To theorize the Michigan Gothic and reassess Woman Hollering Creek, I have organized this chapter into 3 main sections. So I begin by critiquing a bit sort of the larger Gothic genre and sort of constructing what I'm calling the Michigan Gothic. And then I go on to analyze the short story using this framework of the Michigan Gothic. And then I conclude with what I'm terming a hauntology of the oppressed, which is sort of playfully drawing upon and fusing the work of Jacques Derrida and Sheila Sandoval. Which I probably will not get to because I'm running out of time. So the Gothic genre and the speculative genre more generally has questionable roots, roots that are firmly located in colonialism. And so all of the speculative genres, not just the Gothic genre, are interesting because they're problematic in this way, and yet we see authors of color taking them up. So the Gothic genre in particular emerges in Britain in the 18th and early 19th centuries, often voicing xenophobic fears around Eastern Europeans or racialized others. In many ways, the dominant white European Gothic and even the speculative genre itself would not exist without xenophobia, colonialism, and imperialism. The American Gothic, similarly, would not exist without racism, slavery, imperialism, and settler colonialism. So there would not have been enfleshed projection screens called the Gothic genre for white anxiety, fear, revulsion, pleasure and desire, guilt and shame. Yet the Gothic genre is a notoriously mutable, porous, portable genre appearing throughout history and across the world within diverse cultures. As such, its subgenres continue to proliferate, as evident in the diverse genres of the global, tropical, and Latin American Gothic. There are several edited volumes that have come out recently, sort of theorizing these different traditions. Within the US, Gothic traditions have splintered well beyond the monolithic, homogenizing category of the American or US Gothic. Sorry about that. And it has diversified by region. However, little attention has been given to developing what I'm calling tentatively the Latinx Gothic, with a few exceptions. And I am going to sort of move past this toward the end of the section. So one of probably the most inspiring monograph that has informed my thinking about the Latinx Gothic has been Maisha Wester's book that theorizes the African American Gothic. And she argues that in some ways, the African-American Gothic, and you can extend this to other ethnic, or I would argue that you can extend this to other ethnic Gothic traditions, requires a different kind of reading, that you can't take for granted the sort of traditional symbolism of the European or even dominant white American Gothic, that the African-American Gothic provides its own kind of symbolic categories and themes. And so it is in this way that I think about the Mexicana Gothic. And do I have 5 minutes or 1 minute?
If you need 5 more minutes, that's fine.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So, so I'm just going to sort of go ahead and apply this very briefly, Mexicana Gothic to part of the short story. I do want to foreground that for some, it might seem that I'm being kind of loose or sloppy with how I'm using the Gothic. And one of the things that I do talk about in this essay is that often Latinx cultural producers within the speculative genre draw upon and intentionally draw upon and merge different subgenres. So within this story, I see not only sort of the traditional Gothic being redefined or reimagined, but also Cisneros pulling from contemporary horror, and specifically domestic horror. Okay, so whenever I teach the short story to undergrads, which is often, I have them break into groups and map out the story. And what comes into relief when they draw it out is how sort of like constricting this geography is for the main character, how this geography becomes, you know, racialized, class, gendered, sexualized. Okay, and I'm going to skip down. Excuse me. So, so while this story has been approached through realism or the Bildungsroman or coming of age, Cisneros's body of work is known for breaching generic borders and draws upon what we can call Gothic horror and horror elements, and may be read as such. And as in any female Gothic or domestic horror story, a central motif in the short story is isolation, which as always is articulated through culturally and spatially specific terms. A well-known convention of domestic horror and horror more broadly in film and literature is the isolation of the female protagonist in the most seemingly sacred and safest of spaces, the domestic sphere, right? And so we see like right off the bat that Woman Hollering Creek uses this trope and remolds it culturally, geographically, and even epistemologically. So the story begins, and I'm sure we're all very familiar with this popular short story, but it begins by emphasizing isolation and patriarchal control. At the outset of the story, the narrator recalls how Cleofilas leaves her small Mexican town. Quote, the day dawn, Serafin gave Juan Pedro Martinez permission to take Cleofilas Enriqueta de Leon Hernandez as his bride across her father's threshold over several miles of dirt road and several miles of paved over one border and beyond to a town in El Otro Lado on the other side. Already did he divine the morning his daughter would raise her hand over her eyes, look south, and dream of returning to the chores that never ended. 6 good-for-nothing brothers and one old man's complaints. Cisneros here conveys how Cleofilas' isolation is braced by patriarchal underpinnings. Absent, and this has been noted by folks like Mary Pat Brady, for example, absent as a mother or other female figures who might provide guidance and direction. Before Cleofilas departs from her childhood home, her father foresees his daughter returning, pointing to how Clophiles is trapped within a patriarchal geography that delimits in advance her fate. So as I'm approaching my last minute here, so I lied. Also, I'm gonna just read one more quote. So like when reading this story as like horror stories, these themes of isolation and tropes that just, it becomes very clear that Cisneros is using these kind of horror conventions, and sort of the larger point is sort of communicating horror as a structure of feeling that is shaped by the intersections of race, class, gender, sexuality, citizenship. And when approached through the Gothic genre, it becomes clear or clearer how the Ghost of La Llorona creates this kind of claustrophobic geography that becomes a sort of a central part of what I'm calling the Latinx, and more specifically Mexicana Gothic. And so I'll go ahead and stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. So moving on, our next speaker is Dr. Carolyn Gonzalez from California State University, Monterey Bay. And her paper is entitled Possibilities for Love and Allyship in the Grief Keeper by Alexandra Villasante. Dr. Carolyn Gonzalez is an assistant professor of Spanish and Chicanx literatures at California State University, Monterey Bay. And she joined CSU-MB after having worked as an assistant professor at the College of Idaho. So Dr. Gonzalez, it is all you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Christina, and I'm so happy to be here virtually. This is kind of a new field that I'm stepping into for me, the speculative genre, and then also young adult literature, which I've become increasingly more interested in because it's awesome. So I'd very much appreciate hearing what you all have to say and learning from you all. So I'm going to go ahead and read my essay, and this is also kind of in its beginning stages. So once more, any feedback that you'd have, I'd greatly appreciate. So Emily A. McGuire, in her chapter dedicated to science fiction, a village companion to Latina literature, synthesizes the work of various scholars to propose a definition of the term Latin American science fiction. She notes how Darko 7 identifies science fiction as literature of cognitive estrangement, where there's a rigorous scientific explanation provided for peculiar events. According to Samuel L. Delaney, science fiction also portrays with verisimilitude a reality that has not yet happened. Finally, McGuire explains that critics such as Antonio Córdoba and Juan Carlos Toledano Redondo have shown that Latin American science fiction specifically is used to engage with past events or to comment on present political systems and urban environments. Science fiction and speculative fiction more generally can help readers dream of a better future, to learn from a broken past, or be cautioned against possible negative repercussions to humanity's current course of action. As a point of comparison, Chicana murder mysteries also represent the use of a popular genre with the goal to inspire and incite change. For instance, Alicia Gaspar de Alba's 2005 Mystery with a Mission, that's her term, Desert Blood, uses this second popular genre to raise awareness of the femicide of women on the border city of Ciudad Juárez in Mexico since 1993. The accessibility and popularity of these genres can serve as a powerful tool to educate a variety of readers on important topics. Through her text, The Grief Keeper, Alexandra Villasante uses young adult science fiction to critique the current immigration system, particularly as it pertains to the difficulties Latin American children face entering the United States in search of asylum. Villasante was born in New Jersey to parents who immigrated from Uruguay. In an interview for the American Booksellers Association, she explains the origins of her young adult novel. I'm a bit of a science nerd. I read a lot of science journalism for an art school kid. And I'd come across research into a wearable device that might alleviate PTSD symptoms fear, anxiety, grief for soldiers returning from war. I'm also a what if kind of writer. I like to explore what happens when two disparate ideas collide. I started to imagine a device that could actually eradicate fear, anxiety, and grief in a person, make it disappear like magic. Riffing on the idea that energy cannot be created or destroyed, I asked myself, where would those burdensome emotions go? Who would take them on? And the answer I came up with was immigrants, of course. End quote. In Villasante's text, this idea is explored through fiction. Protagonist and narrator Marisol Morales and her sister Gaby are fleeing persecution in El Salvador, have arrived in the United States seeking asylum. When caught trying to escape an immigrant detention center in the United States, Marisol agrees to participate in an experimental treatment for PTSD, which involved her absorbing the symptoms of another young woman named Ray in exchange for the possibility of asylum in the United States. A scientific explanation is given for the usage of these cuffs, which involves an implant that receives neurotransmitters from a donor, Ray, an implant from the donor, which transmits anxiogenic material to the receiver, and a so-called CTS device or cuff that allows for neural activity to be experienced by the received and alleviated from the donor. With this explanation, this text becomes a manifestation of literature of cognitive estrangement, presenting a plausible future scenario to comment on present political systems, thus fitting into the definition of Latin American science fiction previously described. Yet this novel is also a young adult queer romance, with the additional benefit of reaching a younger audience in this commentary towards change. As Marisol becomes increasingly ill and an unequal romantic partnership develops between Marisol and Ray, the novel examines the commodification of others in the healthcare of and relationships with the privileged. Ultimately, Villasante's text forces the reader to consider the need for true allyship and love in the struggle for individual and communal healing. The text begins when, in an interview regarding her asylum case, Marisol is asked what kind of refugee she is, and she feels unprepared to answer the question. We later learn that the particular intersections that Marisol inhabits as an immigrant seeking asylum due to hate because of her sexual orientation are not mentioned. As the interviewer in the text puts it, I'm having trouble understanding the nature of the threats against you. Are they political, religious, based on ethnicity? Marisol can't say. She doesn't know the words for what she's experienced, and the readers don't either. At the beginning of the text, through Marisol's internal dialogue, we learn that Marisol is leaving out key details in the story she's sharing with the interviewer, details she doesn't want to acknowledge to herself, thus giving the reader a very limited understanding of her situation. For instance, she lets the reader know that she has a rule to not think of her brother, though his memory weighs on her all the time, yet the reader doesn't know why. As readers, we do know the circumstances of the threat against Marisol are not those shared in the interview itself. The narration in the initial portion of this text is reminiscent of Benjamin Alire Sáenz's Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe, where the protagonist Daddy, short for Aristotle, hides his romantic feelings for his best friend Dante from himself and the reader. In the novel, Dante compares Ari to an Eric Hopper painting from 1942 called Nighthawks that positions the viewer as looking in on people in a diner late at night, none of them directly engaging with each other. As with Ari and Marisol, we begin by examining an inscrutable character, uncomfortable even with what is in her own mind. Yet we know there's a complex inner world hidden within. These walls crack once the cuff is activated, and eventually it breaks through emotional barriers Marisol has created for herself. As Ray's emotions trickle into her, they become confused with her own, and her emotions and secrets start to unravel for herself and for the reader. Marisol explains, every vision I have of Ray's grief is followed by memories that live in me, despite how hard I've tried to suppress them. These emotions force her to confront memories of her past and her suppressed sexuality. She has memories of her brother Pablo, gradual separation from her in preference of a gang, a romantic relationship with her brother's girlfriend that ends in cruel rejection, and her brother's bigoted response to her sexuality. All of these events culminate in Pablo's death and Marisol's murder of one of his fellow gang members in self-defense, forcing her and her younger sister to flee El Salvador. Ray has also lost a brother, yet the two young women's reactions to the similar events have been markedly different. Marisol has suppressed her grief and pushed herself to move on, with her sister's safety her primary concern, while Ray has just returned home after having been institutionalized. Ray cannot withstand the pain caused by a similar event to what Marisol experienced. As Marisol observes, this girl must be made of different material than I am. Her brother died, and that's terrible. My brother died, and it's terrible. But I'm not melting. No soy mantequita. Through Marisol's words, the text acknowledges mental illness, and the phrase being made of different material represents the fact that not everyone experiences mental illness. Through the experiment, Marisol lives through depression and PTSD from the perspective of an outsider, raising awareness in the reader of the experience of mental illness for someone who's never lived it. The reader witnesses gradual changes in Marisol's personality, unpredictable mood swings, bouts of anger that are uncharacteristic of her, and a crippling sadness for no reason, mirroring the experiences of depression and trauma, as well as a near suicide. Together with raising awareness of how an invisible disability can overtake a person, the text also highlights the privilege in being able to fall apart, in being ill, and still having the possibility and the means to put yourself back together and to heal. Unlike Ray, Marisol doesn't have the luxury of dwelling in her pain if she wants to keep herself and her sister alive. Marisol's situation is also reminiscent of the history of medical experimentation on African Americans, for instance, and the idea that one person's life or suffering is less because of the color of their skin, country or origin, or socioeconomic position. In Villasante's text, these historical injustices are represented by the actions of Indrani, Ray's father's romantic partner, a daughter of immigrant parents from India herself, who's willing to sacrifice another child for Ray. As Marisol falls in love with Ray, a relationship where she's privy to Ray's emotions ensues, with Ray remaining unaware of how the cuffs work, only noticing that she's getting better, and hoping that the cuff will also have positive effects on Marisol. Ray is also ignorant of what's motivated Marisol to participate in this experiment, until Gabi reveals the full circumstances to her when Ray's friend offends Marisol and calls her a lady's maid, cruelly highlighting the forced position that Marisol is in. When Ray finds out the negative effects of the cuff on Marisol, she has a choice. She can continue taking advantage of someone else, despite being aware of the consequences, or she can stop. She decides to act appropriately, removing the cuffs from both their bodies. This shows the potential choices of people with privilege, and Ray makes the right choice, unlike Indrani, who represents a second-generation immigrant who's out of touch with the experience of those who came before her. When Marisol nearly commits suicide, Indrani confesses that Marisol may very well have been granted asylum, but due to her connections as a former employee of USCIS, Indrani was able to use her for the experiment and convince her to participate in it through a lie. This realization is also a blow for the reader, as we realize that despite Marisol's efforts to be a model immigrant, we're to learn impeccable English and emulate the American way of life, the system has betrayed her. She's been selected by Indrani when the director of the Immigration Center said that she was a perfect candidate, a bright, polite girl with excellent English. Further, she learns through Ray that the show she'd used as a model to understand the United States, a fictional Cedar Hollow, is actually Canadian. Once the cuffs are removed, the great inequities in the relationship between Marisol and Ray are revealed. Ray realizes that her family and her own ignorance have allowed her to unknowingly benefit from Marisol's situation. They were fine letting me be a vampire, sucking you dry of your good feelings and leaving you with just the black stuff, the stuff no one wants. Ray strongly rejects this privilege and instead positions herself as Marisol's ally, someone who will support her as she navigates the tricky immigration system. From Ray's situation, a young reader in particular may also learn the importance of asking questions and thinking critically. rather than accepting what one is told as fact. Ray's family is also damaged by Indrani and her father's lies. As Indrani puts it, "I'm sorry I lied to you, Ray. I hope one day you'll trust me again. I only wanted the best for you." Though Marisol notes that Indrani does not regret what she's done, she and Ray's father use their considerable political power to try to enact governmental change regarding undocumented minors as a sort of reparation. Along with their apologies, these are two concrete actions that serve as small steps on the way to healing their family and righting some of their wrongs towards Marisol. Further, Ray's father may also provide Marisol with a platform to dialogue with senators regarding undocumented immigrants, which Marisol reasons she will do for everyone who is not as lucky as me and Gabby. The text ends with Marisol still working to be granted asylum, despite having held up her side of the bargain, despite the sacrifices she's already made. Meanwhile, returning to the relationship between Marisol and Ray, Marisol is left without the benefit of being able to understand Ray at the level of anticipating and absorbing her emotions. The elements of the relationship that did not involve consent are eliminated, and the young women are finally set up to begin a real relationship. These two young women become, as Mexican feminist writer Rosario Castellanos stated in her poem, "Are Not Poetry," and I quote, "two heads together, but not looking at each other, so that no one is turned into a mirror." And Ray explains how they'll navigate their relationship. "We'll do it like normals. We'll talk and fight it out and just do it, like we would have before this Franken shit took over." This way, the two characters are on equal footing, can truly see each other, can willingly exchange emotions. And I'll weave back to the words of Castellanos once more. "This way," and I quote, "humanity, dialogue, poetry begin." Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. That was really great. Okay, and moving on to our final speaker is Dr. Cristina Rhodes, and her paper is entitled "The Story, I Guided It Into My Own Body, Embodied Transformation in Speculative Latinx Youth Literature." Dr. Cristina Rhodes is an assistant professor of ethnic American literature at Shippensburg University of Pennsylvania. Her primary research focus is Latinx children's and young adult literature, with a special emphasis on the body. She is currently working on a manuscript-length project that engages with questions of bodily transformation in non-realist Latinx youth literature. So, Dr. Rhodes.
Thank you, Cristina. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I like visuals, and this means you all don't have to look at me. So let me make that big. All right, there we go. In 2014, a CNN article, Latinx children's author Matt de la Peña questioned, "Where's the Mexican Katniss?" referencing the heroine of Suzanne Collins's blockbuster dystopia, The Hunger Games. De la Peña's question was intended to underscore the lack of Latinxes in popular youth literature, but it created a false notion that there are no dystopic or science fiction texts helmed by Latinxes. Certainly, Latinx youth literature still occupies a niche position within the field, but speculative Latinx youth literature explores a radical future that belies our oppressive histories and supremacist present. In this presentation, I trace material approaches to spectacular Latinx youth literature and establish a framework to understand fantastic bodily transformations in those books. Excuse me, there's also a dog barking, so I apologize if we can hear that as well, but she's sharing her support. Using Mark Oshiro's dystopia, Each of Us a Desert, as a key case study, I examine how young Latinxes with extraordinary powers or supernatural bodies offer possibilities of transformation. And looking at the fantastic in Latinx literature, I consider Latinx futurities and the positionality of young Latinxes to be drivers of progress. Transformation is woven into the fabric of being Latinx and being young. In her introduction to Figurations, Child, Bodies, Worlds, Claudia Castañeda explains, quote, "What is distinctive about the child is that it has the capacity for transformation. Childhood is a time of perpetual bodily transition. Bodies grow and change more in childhood than at any other time in a person's life. The fantastic alterations of characters I study, however, go beyond the scope of typical growth and development and instead render them as special entities that exist outside of the norm and are not bound by hegemonic conventions. What is important to remember is that this identification of the body hinges on its mutability. It must transform. Now, of course, bodies are always changing. We cut and grow our hair, build muscle, shed skin on microscopic levels, among other shifts, some radical, some mundane. But the fantastic transformations I analyze go beyond typical corporeal functions. Bodies, altered via cosmic means and existing in extraordinary worlds, transform in ways beyond normal recognition. In this way, my research on these transformed bodies follows in the tradition of scholars like Sami Schalk, whose Body Minds Reimagined, quote, explores how Black women writers of speculative fiction reimagine the possibilities of body minds and thereby change the rules of non-realist worlds. Through this presentation and the larger project to which it belongs, I build a framework to understand fantastic corporeal elements and embodied experiences in Latinx literature, particularly that with young characters or written for young readers. Latinx youth are and have always been a precarious population, facing everything from assimilationist education in the early 20th century to family separation now. Latinx youth confront significant challenges to their socio-political well-being. Driven by these contexts, much research on Latinx youth and literature tends to focus on topics such as immigration, assimilation, or racism. I center this project on literature for young readers because of the paucity of scholarship that explores Latinx children's literature beyond its traditional culturally located borders. As Trevor Buffoni and Cristina Herrera note in their introduction to Nerds, Goths, Geeks, and Freaks, Outsiders, and Chicanx and Latinx Young Adult Literature, quote, to understand Latinx youth identities, it is necessary to shed light on outsiders who might not fit within Latinx popular cultural paradigms. Taking up this charge, I consider supernatural Latinx youth or those who inhabit fantastic or magical worlds. I focus this analysis on speculative fiction in keeping with Cathryn, Merla-Watson, and B.V. Olguin's assertion that, quote, Latinx sci-fi and the speculative arts, even the most bleak, terrifying, and dystopic, project a utopian spirit through the genre's capacity for incisive social critique that cuts to the bone of our shared pasts and present. In this way, I link bodily transformation with progress and the future. According to Cathryn S. Ramirez, who coined the term Chicana futurism, a sibling of Afrofuturism, by appropriating the imagery of science and technology, Chicana futurist and, in extension, Latinx futurists works disrupt age-old racist and sexist binaries that exclude Chicanas and Chicanos from visions of the future. But this idealist view is at odds with a future that is actually accessible to Latinx youth. Angel Daniel Matos and John M. Wargo question, which children, both literal and symbolic, have the privilege of being protected? Which youth have the privilege of tomorrows that are open, utopic, or even possible? They further explain many queer, non-white, lower-class youth simply do not have access to the material, aesthetic, practical, and ideological means to exist and thrive in the present, much less to envision realities different from the ones in which they currently live. What's more, within the specific context of Latinx populations, Rafael Perez Torres asserts, quote, to think of a future for Latinx and Chicanx studies, let alone to consider a Latinx futurity, may indeed be an exercise in magical thinking at odds with the exigencies of the now. Taken together, these assertions indicate the need for radical transformation if Latinx youth are to make it to an imagined future. Utilizing the many and varied examples of embodied transformation in Latinx youth literature, I read such corporeal shifts as the antidote to our current halted progress. Within my own research, however, Mark Oshiro's Each of Us a Desert is an anomaly. Typically, I foreground bodies that seek fantastic transformation. But Shochi, Oshiro's protagonist, wishes to release herself from an already fantastically altered body. In a future decimated by famine and global warming, Xochi is a cuentista, a story keeper who listens to her neighbor's sins and gives them back to Solis, the sun god, to atone and seek mercy. Being a cuentista is a bodily experience for Xochi. She explains, even if I gave Solis back these stories, I had sort of a memory within my bones of that surge, the passage of truth from one body to another. I had learned long ago how to adjust and settle into the wave of the story, weaving it into my own body. This is a painful process. The story stretched between bones and organs, and I pushed the pain and discomfort down, further away from my heart. The story then lives in Shoshi's body until she can ceremonially regurgitate it, another painful process which depletes her and causes her to forget the story itself. If the cuentista does not purge these stories, then calamity will supposedly befall the world. But Xochi begins to keep stories spurred by the knowledge she gains from them and the hopes that she can protect her village from marauders. The first story she keeps, quote, burrowed behind one of her ribs in a place so deep that she couldn't reach it without tearing herself open. The bodily trauma of keeping the stories leads to Xochi's escape from her village. She wonders, maybe it was selfish of me to want more, but I had to choose for me. Xochi desires to be released from the confines of her corporeal reality as a cuentista. She thinks, quote, I was born to a body meant to help others, but I am so selfish, Solis. I give and I give and I give myself to you, to mi gente, but why did you put me in a body with such unending desire that wants so much that it cannot have? In this way, Xochi locates her body as the epicenter of her trauma, but also the possible genesis for change. Seeking that release, Xochi spends much of the book searching for Simone, a curandera, who can supposedly absolve Xochi of her duties as a cuentista. She explains, I kept others' stories for myself, so I could find my own story, so I could rid myself of this power. For Xochi, transforming away from the fantastic to the mundane is necessary for her own survival. She explains, their stories lived on within me, and they were changing me. Xochi is consumed by the stories. They are, quote, eating her away inside, corrupting Xochi and erasing her individual existence. When Xochi realizes that she cannot be cured, she feels lost. The stories she has consumed become an entity unto themselves. Quote, these stories, they've found one another inside me, and they're becoming one thing, one living cuento within me. She resolves to purge the stories one last time. But because the stories have so irreversibly changed her body, latching on to everything as they prepared to leave, she wonders, how much of me will they take? Will you take all of me? Will I be an empty shell? Even with this fear, Xochi resolves that she will resist the cuentista urge after the stories have been given back from her body. Even though no one could rid her of the magic of being a cuentista, Xochi understands she has the power to make change when no one else is willing or able to do so. She asserts, no child should be granted this power. No one person should have this. So instead, she will tell the world that we need a change, that las cuentistas are overburdened and overwhelmed. It's time for a new honesty, one that cannot be corrupted by greed or ambition or fear. The book closes shortly after this proclamation, leaving the reader wondering what happens to Xochi after she releases the stories. We cannot confirm if her fears of full depletion are true or if she is able to make an activist stance for change. Rather, Oshiro ends with Xochi saying, I'm not ashamed of who I am or what I did. I just hope that you have been listening because this is the last story I will ever tell you. We're led to believe that this initiates Shoshi's final purge. But without a clear resolution, the reader is left in that final moment of waiting, the sick anticipation of one's belly contracting before heaving. But this release substantiates Shoshi's radical transformation. Up until this moment, though she feels that her body is outside of her control, it has been shifting to facilitate this necessary closing. When she resolves to give back the stories one last time, she cements the radical transformation of her body. The process of relieving herself of these stories she has saved is vital. While Shoshi's early regurgitation processes are not unlike the indigenous purgation rituals associated with Tlazolteotl, the Nachwa goddess of filth, this final scene is striking because it transcends a historic grounding for the cuentista's job and moves Shoshi into the future. In his linking of Tlazolteotl and Gloria Anzaldua's Coatlicue state, George Hartley explains that Tlazolteotl embodies all of these otherwise disparate elements referring to birth, death, purification, and pollution. Likewise, Shoshi's connection with Tlazolteotl allows contradictions to coexist. Within Shoshi's final act of purging lives her past, present, and future. In a way, it is as if Shoshi sheds her old body, expunging the form that was abused and repurposed by the cuentos she kept locked inside. Within this metamorphosis, then, rests possibility. Gloria Anzaldúa explains, struggling with a story is a bodily activity. Shoshi's body is central in the collection and archiving of these stories, and the stories facilitate the change necessary to move Shoshi forward. It is important to note that though I typically center stories that facilitate fantastic transformations and that contain more clear resolutions, my theorization of embodied transformation and its linkage to forward progress does not exclude characters like Shoshi, whose progress could potentially devolve her or make her less fantastic. Shoshi's desire to no longer be a cuentista means that she is advocating for a life and a world that is no longer beholden to the whims of Solis, not that she is seeking a corporeal shift that would render her mundane. Gloria Anzaldúa explains, we must push against any boundaries that have outlived their usefulness. In this way, the power of the cuentista has, in fact, spurred a fantastic embodied transformation in Shoshi. It has illuminated flaws within existing social and corporeal systems, and Shoshi is able to ameliorate those systems via action from within her body, or we're led to believe she does so. I hope she does. That Oshiro leaves us on the precipice of change is not insignificant when considering the accessibility and efficacy of futurity. For an equitable future to be brought into existence means that transformation needs to extend outward from Shoshi and characters like her to effect more communal transition. And reading Latinx speculative fiction that features the story of extraordinary bodies in tension and relation with each other and the larger world, I theorize the importance of transformed bodies, including Shoshi's, hinges on their ability to effect radical outward change. Presented and explored in young adult literature, these bodies act and react with asymmetrical structures of power and oppression, seeking transformation on individual and communal levels. That Shoshi's transformed body won't just impact her own self-efficacy, but potentially that of her community, magnifies the impact and progress facilitated by radical bodily transformation. Shoshi's power isn't just to guide a story into her own body, but it is more deeply grounded in the release and resignation she comes to at the end of the book, which demonstrates the need for societal shift. In closing, I want to re-emphasize that my reading of Shoshi is part of a larger paradigm I observe in recent Latinx speculative fiction for young readers. This project questions how fantastic bodies are involved in bringing about progress. In books like Each of Us a Desert, I find Gloria Anzaldúa's edict, I change myself, I change the world, made manifest. Ultimately, this individual to communal shift emblematizes the need for and emphasis on embodied transformation in speculative Latinx youth literature. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Cristina. That was really great. And thank you to all of our panelists. So we do have some time for questions and for dialogue. There's so many, excuse me, my dog is trying to steal my napkin. So I have two dogs, I'm sorry, around here. So hopefully they'll be quiet during this time. They've been good so far. So there's so much that I was thinking throughout your papers. Obviously there's a really great overlap between the three presentations, but I think Cathryn, I'll start with you, because I'm really fascinated by this idea of using the Gothic horror lens to examine Women Hollering Creek. But then I was also struck by Cristina's talk about futurity, and so at the end, one of the things that was always troubling for me at the end of Women Hollering Creek is how, at least when I've taught it, so many of my students, they review the ending as just positive, right? Because, Cleófilas finds her voice, so to speak. She's laughing, or, she's sort of embodying La Gritona, right? The actual Woman Hollering Creek. But at the same time, we can't lose sight of the fact that, ultimately she's going back to her father's house, right? She's returning to that site. So I'm wondering to what extent maybe you can think about in the Gothic horror lens, how does that also lend itself to conversations of futurity? Because I'm thinking, what kind of future does Cleófilas actually have if she wanted to initially leave, right? The funny line, right? The six good for nothing brothers and, and her father. So I'm not sure if I'm making any sense, but do you kind of see that connection between futurity and the Gothic horror genre?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm also thinking, so my students also have a similar reading, and I use a short story a lot. And, I have to remind them, like you said, that, it's very possible that, she has to return to her, small town in Mexico, to another sort of back to the same kind of this like patriarchal structure, different than the one in Seguin, but patriarchal nonetheless. But at the same time, like she could also like possibly like stay in San Antonio or, go somewhere. Like it's not set in stone, and it's still open-ended. And one of the things I talk about in the larger chapter is Avery Gordon's definition of the ghostly as a figure of uncertainty, but also one of hope and potential futurity. That these narratives and lived experiences can be transformed and reimagined and changed, much in the same. And I think that's also embodied through this other kind of specter of La Gritona, like she who yells rather than cries, right? And I think it's also significant, going a little bit of a different direction, but that like Women Hollering Creek doesn't end with like anybody dying, right? Like much in the same way that so like that already the mold of La Llorona has been broken. And so I also think about the conclusion of the film Get Out, where Jordan Peele originally wrote it to where the main character, who's African-American, dies, and then decided, no, within this current political moment, like we need this character to live, which it was sort of, for me, this obviously this like strong declaration of and demand for futurity. So in short, I think that the horror, the Gothic horror, is rewritten or reimagined through the ambiguity at the end, which allows for hope and therefore futurity. Sorry, that was a really long-winded answer. It was a great question.
Yeah. No problem. Thank you for that. Were there other questions, or I can continue any of? Okay, so it's obviously there was a lot of overlap between your papers, Caro and Chris, and so one of the questions, and Katie, you were, Cristina, you talked about this, and so in the earlier panel today, we were talking about the genre of historical fiction and why it is that historical fiction has been sort of the purview of a lot of queer Latinx writers, Latina writers. And so, so Chris, maybe if you could talk about this, and Caro, perhaps you could also add to this, because I think it's definitely relevant for your paper as well, why speculative fiction in Latinx youth literature? Why, if you could talk a little bit more about childhood and why this genre sees children and young people as the makers of change, especially considering that in many patriarchal families, certainly the case in mine, children were not seen as our young people were not seen as even having a voice, let alone the capacity for change. All that, the transformation, the capacity for change, that's until you get older, until you get wiser. But you're not the source yet. Someday maybe you'll get there. So I'm wondering, like, how Latinx youth speculative literature attempts to challenge this idea that children are merely bodies and have nothing really to contribute except until they grow up.
Really great question. I think in a lot of ways, right, youth literature as a whole gives us the space to sort of imagine what children's agency looks like outside of the parameters of heteronormativity. And I think that we get this sort of play space of what it would be if children were treated more seriously as change makers. And I do a lot of, or I kind of segued into doing the speculative fiction research because my research during graduate school was on contemporary youth activism and how contemporary youth are activists and are making change, like right now in this real actual human moment versus in an imagined future. And I leapt into the imagined future because the trend that I was seeing both in real Latinx youth activists, as well as children's and young adult literature that explored youth activism, Latinx youth activism, was this sort of emphasis on it's our future and we're going to take it. And obviously, right, Latinx youth is written by adults who are imagining this for children, and so that we can get into that whole other kind of ethereal thing there. But I think that it's important to empower Latinx youth and to shore up Latinx youth readers to be able to then say, okay, we're obviously in a moment in time when having young people making change is going to be really vital. And they're also one of the most precarious populations, like I said in my paper, that they're constantly used as political pawns. They're constantly written off as not knowing things about their lives and about their circumstances, but they certainly do, right? Sociological studies and anthropological studies show that children really do understand. And so I think that we get this really kind of beautiful chirotic moment with speculative Latinx youth literature that says, not only do these children understand their presence, but they can imagine a future and make that future, bring that future into being. And here are some ways that we can see this maybe fantastically playing out, like obviously in each of us a desert, right? This is a world that has, undergone famine and fire. And so hopefully that's not going to happen. But certainly I think that there's this idea of empowering youth and also building the future that youth could bring into being.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Caro, did you want to add something?
I don't know how much I could add to that response. I mean, it was very, very complete, but I feel like, what I was thinking about was Gloria Anzaldua's work, Prietita en La Llorona, even just going back to that and the idea of her idea of creating literature for children for them to create change is something that is continued in this same tradition, right, of young adult literature.
Yeah, Carol, and I was really interested in your reference to containment and how and we see this, I think, in the Gothic horror tradition as well, and speculative literature, but thinking of systems that contain, the immigration system, right, literally contains bodies, right? Patriarchal families contain. And so then, of course, how does containment overlap with trauma? And so, Gato, I don't know, does your work also engage in with trauma theory and looking at how trauma theory informs Villasante's text? Containment also of memory, right? This is constant. So it's systems that contain, and how sometimes we contain to protect ourselves, but how these external forces also contain. So I was really struck by that kind of overlap between all your papers.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I'd have to think about further, but we definitely do see this trauma and fear even just manipulating the way that the characters think, right? That she feels like she can't, Marisol at least feels like she can't go beyond these borders in her own mind that have been created by trauma. So it is something I'll have to consider that. Do you have any suggestions in terms of potential trauma theory to look at?
I'm thinking, Kathy Carruth, for example, although if I remember correctly, I don't think that she engages as much in sci-fi or fantasy. Let me see, who else?
Diana Taylor, is that her name?
Yes, Diane Herndl Taylor, her? Is that her name? Yeah.
I've cited her in the past before,
Yeah,
but I don't know if she does fantastic stuff.
Yeah, I'm not. Sorry, Carol. Carolyn, I was putting you on the spot. Now I'm like saying
no.
Yeah. No, but I think
that's a really good question.
Yeah, no, I because I was in Villasante's novel. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. But I was just really interested in how all of these texts, whether it's Women Hollering Creek, Each of Us a Desert, and The Grief Keeper, deal in some ways with trauma, right? And how part of transforming and wanting to see a better world is to address trauma, right? Trauma is not something that you can ignore, right? It's the trauma of a memory, especially in the case of Marisol, for example. So it's just, I don't know, I think all your papers really communicate and speak with each other. I think that is really fascinating. Were there any other questions or comments from anybody else? Dialogue.
I had a question for Chris, if that's okay.
Sure, absolutely.
I was just wondering if any of the texts that you'd looked at, if bodily transformation had been something negative, and how you negotiate that in your research.
That's a great question. So as I was putting together this paper, I really grappled with if I thought that Shoshi's transformation was negative or not, like if it did it actually benefit her and her community. And though, I mean, obviously I kind of ultimately think that it does, I'm still not entirely, I have not convinced myself yet if Shoshi fits within this paradigm. But by and large, what I have found is that any transformation is for the most part forward seeking, but there are a lot of gray areas with what is positive and what is negative, right? I think I've actually done research on Grief Keeper, and I in an forthcoming article, right, I argue that doesn't quite bring about a future, right? That we're kind of left in that bend, just like this book leaves us in that bend of, are we quite there yet? But I do, when I think about Grief Keeper, and I linked Grief Keeper with Adam Silvera's More Happy Than Not, that both of those books sort of like tentatively give us a taste of what a good future could be, and then they just don't get us there. But I argue that they are useful in terms of laying the groundwork for more queer speculative fiction to come, even though I think that they're both that they both kind of leave us frustrated with their transformative elements.
That's interesting you say that. I've taught this text in the past, and students are always angry at the ending, or have been angry at the ending so far. Like, why didn't she just get asylum? and so it is, but I mean, that's not, ultimately I've decided that's not realistic, right? That she's, so we're really keeping with that in the text. But you're right, there's not that future that we'd imagine. You can't fully see it.
Yeah, and that's kind of one of the things that I really like about some of these authors, Latinx YA authors, is that they're deliberately kind of pushing against this idea that the story has to have this neat and tidy ending, right? And so kind of resisting this idea that you can just, right, that there's, it closed, it's done, it's final, and there's an open-endedness, and but it's really, as a reader, it's really frustrating, but as a scholar, we understand maybe what these writers are trying to do by resisting the neat, clean ending, right? So those are really great questions and points. So I think we're just out of time now, but were there any final comments? No.
Oh, I was just going to say really quickly, and it's super fast. There was someone else in terms of trauma who would be not popping in my brain, but Ben Olguin actually just came out with a book, and I think Violentology is in the book, but it pertains to like I believe like violence and trauma, and that might be useful. We're thinking through trauma in relationship to sci-fi.
Mm-hmm.
Could you repeat the name of the author?
Ben Olguin.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and you've collaborated a lot with him, haven't you, Katie?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
he did.
Yeah.
He went on a sci-fi journey with me.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody, on behalf of us in the Latinx Literature and Culture Society. This was really great. These are really awesome papers. And so let me just stop the recording right now.